Here we go. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are. Here, Ana Lúcia Araújo, and this is the Slaveryarchive book club, hosted by me and my colleague Alex Gill, who is also highlighted here. So today we are very happy to be here to host our colleague historian Randy Browne, who will be talking about his new book, The Driver's Story, Labor and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery, that was published last year, 2024, with Penn Press. And Randy Browne is a historian of Atlantic slavery. He is a full professor at Xavier University. And this is indeed his second book. His first book is indeed here as well, Surviving Slavery in the British Caribbean, that was published with Penn Press in 2017. Then, if you don't know that book, it's also an opportunity for you to take a look at that. And that book focused on the problem of survival in Berbice, that is part of what is present-day Guyana. And this is a book that won the Ohio Academic of History's Publication Award and also the biennial Elsa Gouveia Book Prize from the Association of Caribbean Historians. Browne's scholarship has been supported by grants and fellowships from the Library Company of Philadelphia, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Huntington Library, and also the U.S. Department of Education. And he has also articles on slavery and the transatlantic slave trade that appeared then in William and Mary Quarterly, the New West Indian Guide, and also Slavery and Abolition. And he is a member of the editorial board of Slavery and Abolition as well. And at Xavier, Browne teaches then courses on the history of African diaspora, slave rebellions, and the transatlantic slave trade and colonial America. So we are going to start the session inviting then Randy to present the book. And after this presentation, that is, let's say about 20-25 minutes, we're going to have your questions. This is a broadcast that is also on YouTube, and the whole session will be on YouTube after we finish. So if you have any questions, keep them for after Randy's presentation, and feel free also to use the chat to introduce yourselves or to put any other comments you have, and you are going to handle this once the presentation is done. Welcome, Randy. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Anna, thanks so much for having me, and Alex as well for co-hosting. I'm really excited to be here. I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk with you all, and I want to thank all of you joining us today. We have so many reasons to be distracted and are pulled in so many directions right now. So it's a real privilege that you've taken some time out of your Saturday afternoon to be here. As Anna said, I'll give a kind of brief introduction and overview to the book. I want to start by telling you how I got interested in drivers and the driving system and why this project seemed important to me. I'm going to start actually way back in the mid 17th century, which is quite a lot before most of the book really takes place. I'm mostly in the early 19th century, but back in the mid 17th century, sugar planters on what was then the English island of Barbados developed a new method of labor control that they called the driving system. And it was designed to solve what they saw as their fundamental problem, which was how to extract labor from people who vastly outnumbered them and, of course, resisted their enslavement. Then the position of the driver, which was created about the same time, and the driving system both spread pretty quickly to plantations throughout the Caribbean and beyond. Everywhere, the figure that had to make the system work in practice was the driver. This was an enslaved person, usually an enslaved man, who was appointed by white plantation authorities to supervise, manage, and punish other enslaved laborers. And so, what this meant in practice was that drivers were trapped essentially between the insatiable labor demands of white plantation authorities and the constant resistance of other enslaved laborers. And I wrote the driver's story mainly because I wanted to know how drivers coped. That is, what was it like to be caught at the center of what the historian Vincent Browne has described as a never-ending war between enslavers and the enslaved? More broadly, it seemed to me that focusing on drivers offered a way to try to understand the labor regime of Atlantic slavery and the mechanics of racial capitalism, not as abstractions and not from the view of planners or merchants, but is seen and experienced by enslaved people themselves. And so that was a motivation for the project. Um, to try to explore that predicament, I made a series of strategic decisions pretty early in the research and writing of this book. First of those was that I was going to focus on Caribbean slave societies and mainly on British colonies in the early 19th century. I concentrated especially on the Guianas, that's Berbice and Demerara, Essequibo, and on Trinidad, because those colonies produce some extraordinary bodies of evidence that don't exist for most other slave societies. And the most important of those were extensive first-person testimonies from thousands of enslaved people, including hundreds of drivers. I'd be happy to talk more about these sources and the other types of evidence I used later, if you all have questions. The second strategic decision I made, which was because I found that the driving systems dynamics were surprisingly stable and similar throughout the Americas across time and space, was that rather than organize the book around change over time or comparisons between different slave systems or crop regimes, for example, that I was going to organize it thematically around different dimensions of drivers' lives. And finally, the third decision I made was that throughout the book, I was going to do everything I could to center drivers themselves. That is, I was going to try to explore their motivations, their struggles, and try to see the world of Atlantic slavery as closely as I could from the driver's own point of view. Ultimately, what I came to see with this project was that drivers stood at the very center of enslaved people's working lives, perhaps most obviously, but also their social relationships and their struggles against slavery. For me, exploring the driver's world also offered some opportunities to see some of the most important issues in the study of Atlantic slavery over the past several decades with fresh eyes. So now, over the next roughly 20 minutes, I'd like to share with you how I tried to make sense of the driver's world. And I'll do that by focusing on three basic historical problems or questions that I struggled to answer in the course of writing this book. And then before we move on to discussion, I'll try to sketch out what I see as some of the bigger implications of the project. For drivers, a fundamental challenge was that the enslavers above them and the enslaved laborers below them pushed and pulled them in competing directions. Enslavers, of course, wanted to extract as much labor as possible from their enslaved workforce, while field laborers resisted the labor regime and the drivers who had to enforce it in pretty much every way they could. And so the first question I tried to answer was, how did drivers manage those conflicting pressures? I found that some drivers tried to satisfy their enslavers by relentlessly pushing the people they supervised to work to the utter limits of human capacity. In doing so, they often relied on the same basic tools that their enslavers favored: terror and violence. When field laborers showed up late, when someone couldn't or would not keep pace with their peers or disobeyed a driver's orders, drivers were pretty quick to turn to violence. They were also likely to report anyone they saw as a troublemaker to white plantation authorities, really eager to shift the blame for any sort of disruptions or problems away from them to the people they supervised. Of course, the major problem with this strategy was that it often backfired, provoking even more resistance from field laborers, the people whose cooperation drivers needed. Um, One of the things that stood out to me in the course of my research was just how much day-to-day resistance and insubordination drivers faced. If you look, for example, at the tabulations of punishments inflicted on enslaved people in the Guianas, you'll find hundreds of people in any given period punished for everything from insulting drivers with insolent speech and making threats to organizing strikes and slowdowns, and even physically assaulting drivers. I also found that in slave societies across the Caribbean and beyond, enslaved laborers who thought the drivers were too severe even killed them. And so, savvy drivers who wanted to keep their position, we'll come to that in a moment, knew there were limits when it was in, or times rather, when it was in their best interest to ally themselves with the field laborers below them. They used discretion to turn a blind eye to minor acts of resistance. Sometimes they tolerated, even encouraged strikes, slowdowns, desertions. When they were given impossible workloads, sometimes drivers tried to renegotiate labor demands with white plantation authorities. Now, these kinds of actions enhanced a driver's authority within the slave community and encouraged other enslaved people to see a driver as a leader and perhaps cooperate with him. But they also put drivers in the really precarious position of challenging their enslavers' orders, either implicitly or directly. The typical outcome of these kinds of confrontations is illustrated by the experience of one head driver on a sugar plantation who told colonial officials that whenever the manager gave him a task that was, in his words, simply too much for the people below him to complete, the manager responded by locking him in the stocks as punishment. Even then, many drivers took calculated actions to support other enslaved people. One of the most, for me, compelling ways they did this was to protect people from what they saw as an unjustified or an excessive punishment. In one case, a driver who did so offered a remarkable justification for, in his case, refusing to whip another enslaved man as severely as his enslaver demanded. As he put it, we slaves must help one another. As you might imagine, enslavers were quick to try to crush this sort of solidarity between drivers and other enslaved people, really quick to punish drivers for anything they saw as enabling rather than crushing resistance from below. I found case after case of drivers who were flogged, demoted, some came sold off the plantation entirely for supposedly being too soft on other enslaved laborers. Um, in the end, what I came to see was that the fundamental problem for drivers was that no matter how well they did their job, their enslavers always demanded more. There was a case I always remember of a head driver, a man named Francisco, who worked on a Jamaican sugar plantation towards the end of the 18th century, who essentially explained how the logic of the driving system itself doomed drivers to fail. Whenever the overseer was watching him, Francisco said that he knew he had to swear and tear at the field laborers he supervised in a futile effort to extract more work from them than was humanly possible. The problem, Francisco explained, was that everyone was already working harder than any other slaves in the area. Even then, the overseer wanted more work of him and the field laborers than he was able to make them do, he said. More indeed than was right, and more than they were able to do. So, for drivers like Francisco, being trapped at the center of a capitalist labor system, a system where they had no real incentives to offer the people they supervised, and where labor demands were insatiable, meant enduring a special kind of existential horror every single day. This leads me to the second question I struggled to answer then, which was if trying to make the driving system work was such a nightmare, why then would anyone want to be a driver? I confess at first I thought the answer to this question was pretty straightforward. As I'm sure many of you know, Caribbean plantations were notorious death traps. Most enslaved people recognized that they had really slim odds of becoming free, and instead, many of them focused on finding ways to get by or survive. And I found that becoming a driver is one of the best, maybe one of the only ways to prolong one's survival. Field laborers typically died in their early 40s, but drivers lived well into their 50s or even 60s, sometimes even older. That's because their position allowed them to escape the brutal physical demands of field labor, and because their enslavers strategically incentivized them by giving drivers better clothing, housing, and food than other enslaved people. And these material differences clearly mattered to drivers. They had a tangible impact on the quality and quantity of their lives. But the more I researched, the more I came to see that becoming a driver also offered some unusual opportunities to make important social connections with other enslaved people. So there's this whole other realm of things drivers got out of this position. This is especially true for male drivers, many of whom aspired to become what Africans in Africa and the diaspora called big men. Big man was essentially someone who tried to attain or accrue what was known as wealth in people by recruiting and retaining followers, especially women, in exchange for resources and protection. And I found there are two major ways that being a driver helped enslaved men act like big men. First, drivers used their position to offer valuable resources and services to the people they hoped to claim as followers. They negotiated with managers to get the people below them essentials like food and rest. They testified in support of enslaved complainants in court. They used their authority within the slave community to help enforce unwritten rules and customary rights sometimes even supervising unofficial courts to prosecute crimes like theft. When people got sick, as they often did, drivers were the ones who often took the initiative to solicit help from specialized healers, such as practitioners of obia. All of these actions were risky, of course, since drivers could get into serious trouble with their enslavers for going beyond the bounds of their official role. This is not, from the enslavers' point of view, what drivers were supposed to be doing. But they helped drivers cultivate strong social ties with other enslaved people who, in many cases, came to see drivers as leaders. The second way that drivers acted like big men was by creating relationships with enslaved women and building families, often pretty large families. I found that drivers were statistically way more likely than other enslaved men to be married, that when they did, they had more children than other enslaved men, and maybe most striking of all, drivers were really the only men on Caribbean plantations to have multiple wives. That is, they were among the only men who were able to form the kind of polygamous marriages that African men often wanted. Drivers' unusual success in building these kind of large families reflected both their relatively higher social status and their ability to offer their dependents or followers access to scarce resources like food and a modicum of protection. Of course, I don't want to oversell this. As enslaved men, there were sharp limits as to how much a driver could become a big man, and especially how much they could protect their family members. This is something I was reminded of again and again, in particular when reading about drivers' failed efforts to prevent white plantation authorities from sexually abusing their wives and daughters. Overall, the personal relationships that drivers cultivated within the slave community, though, where they essentially refashioned African practices in the way that so many enslaved people did in the Americas, as part of creolization, helped them deal with the emotional toll of slavery by achieving a sense of meaning and purpose that transcended that official role as a planter appointed labor supervisor. And in doing so, they also helped other enslaved people resist the persistent threat of social death under slavery by finding connection, belonging, and kinship. The third major question I confronted with this project was about drivers and rebellion. I knew even before getting into this book that throughout the Americas, there are examples of drivers who served as rebel leaders. And I knew that drivers often played the key role in preventing or crushing other rebellions. So they played these two very different roles with rebellion. And so, for lack of a better way to explain this, I wanted to know, what did drivers mean to rebellion, and what did rebellion mean for drivers? Um, I really had trouble figuring out exactly how I was going to answer this question, but ultimately decided that to understand drivers' rebel politics, that I was going to focus on a major uprising in Berbice at the very end of 1813 and into 1814. This was a conspiracy that involved hundreds, perhaps thousands of enslaved people spread across about 24 plantations over several miles. And it was organized by Africans who identified as members of different diasporic nations or national groups. These were communities made up of Africans from the same broad region who formed new ethnic or national identities in the Americas, such as Coromontes or Congos. And these nations held a series of secret nighttime meetings where they appointed kings and other officers in preparation for war. All of this was documented in really extraordinary detail over some 600 pages of testimony and interrogations, and involved more than 100 people, including some 20 drivers. After spending way more than I thought I would sifting through the different accounts, these conflicting, overlapping, intersecting accounts people gave about the rebellion, about its leadership, and about their goals, I found that drivers had three basic relationships to this rebellion. First, along with other male leaders of these different African nations, drivers were the main organizers of this rebel plot. As the kings, governors, and other officers of the nations to which they belonged, these drivers were able to expand the geographic reach of their authority, seeking followers beyond their own plantations and recruiting people with similar national or ethnic identities to join them in rebellion. On one plantation, for example, people organized under a driver named Pompey, who was known as the head man of the Mandingos, or as another witness put it, king and father at top. On another estate, there were true drivers, each from different African nations, who organized their countrymen to, quote, take the country to ourselves and become our own masters. And in a whole other region of the colony, there was a man named Caesar, who was head driver and king of the Congos in the region, who traveled from plantation to plantation in a hammock, carried by a series of attendants and trailed by dozens of followers to try to mobilize his fellow Congos. Meanwhile, this is the second relationship drivers had to the rebellion. Other drivers tried to keep their distance from what seemed to them like a suicidal plan. These dodgers, to borrow a term from the historian Marlene Kars, who's written a wonderful book about the 1763 revolt in Berbice, resisted pressure from other enslaved people who often looked to them precisely because they had the kind of social authority and leadership skills needed to mobilize and command rebels. They seemed like natural or at least skilled leaders. In many cases, drivers explicitly refused to accept appointments as rebel leaders. In some cases, they ordered other people, especially the people under them on the plantations where they lived and worked, to stay away from national assemblies and keep their distance from rebel organizers. There was one driver who told Caesar, the head driver in Congo King I mentioned just a moment ago, that if Caesar kept trying to recruit him, that he would physically attack Caesar. These drivers often cited the failure of previous rebellions in the Guyanas, which they remembered in surprising detail, and the brutal consequences that befell convicted rebels as their reason for staying out of the fray. Third and finally, a few drivers played the decisive role in undermining the rebellion by telling white authorities what they'd seen and heard. The most prominent of these was a head driver named Alexander, who blew the whistle just a few days before the rebels were supposed to attack. Uh, Drivers like Alexander may have had multiple reasons for making such decisions. They may have been afraid that rebels would see them as targets to be eliminated rather than potential leaders. Many of them remembered that in previous rebellions, drivers had actually been killed by rebels. Some of them must have also worried about their family's safety during what could have turned out to be a protracted and certainly a bloody war. In Alexander's case, he had to think about the 8 children he had with one wife, the 6 he had with another, and the several dozen grandchildren that he had. For whatever combination of reasons, many drivers in this case concluded that the rebellion was simply not in their best interest. Um, and in the end, I can understand that decision. They avoided being tortured and executed, which was the fate for the rebel leaders and many other people who participated. And in some cases, these drivers were rewarded by colonial authorities with a series of symbolic and material gifts, including sizable cash awards in some cases. Not their freedom, though, I should stress. I get one of the other really interesting things, though, I found when I looked at drivers in rebellion was that the political aspirations of the drivers who did organize this rebellion were very different than those of ordinary enslaved people. Instead of liberating everyone and abolishing the plantation system, those drivers wanted to overthrow white authorities. That's the kind of goal that everybody could get behind. But then they really wanted to free themselves and not others and run the plantations alongside other big men. So their vision of freedom was one where a lot of the hierarchies of the plantation system would continue after the rebellion. They would be on top, but the field laborers, these are people that the drivers referred to as the low class of people, calling themselves officers and saying the field laborers are going to be the soldiers. They assumed that those people would continue working under them, engaging in plantation production. And understandably, most people weren't willing to risk their lives for this kind of a revolution. And so for me, even beyond drivers, focusing on their role in rebellion deepened my appreciation of just how hard it was to build the kind of solidarities and support needed to wage a successful war against slavery. At least some of the time, the people who were best positioned to lead had goals that conflicted with those of ordinary people. So if we zoom out, what do we gain by putting driving system at the center of Atlantic slavery's history? Um, as I see it, in addition to a better understanding of how the plantation system worked on the ground, I think it helps us see more clearly how enslavers managed to extract so much labor from the people they enslaved in the face of relentless resistance. If we return to this idea of slavery as a never-ending state of war, and everything that I've seen in the course of my research suggests that was the case, well, then why did enslaved people find victory elusive? Um, there are lots of answers to this question, but over the past few decades, I think there have been two basic approaches or two basic ways of kind of getting to this question, and maybe more broadly to the study of Atlantic slavery in general. On the one hand, there's been a lot of work that has emphasized the overwhelming power of the institution itself, of enslavers, focusing on the ways that slavery and the slave trade commodified human beings and extracted wealth. On the other hand, many historians, especially social and cultural historians of enslaved people, have shown the many ways that enslaved people fought for their freedom, resisted, or at least tried to carve out some measure of autonomy. Um, those two bodies of work are not always in as much dialogue with one another as we might like. And one of the things I've tried to do in this book is bring those two approaches together to try to understand how what we might think of as strategies of coercion, right, the system, and then strategies of subversion or enslaved people's resistance developed in response to one another, to try to look top down and bottom up at the same time. To be sure, the driving system, right, a system that relied on a subset of enslaved people for labor extraction and social control, was incredibly volatile and violent. Drivers, of course, did not want the same things that their enslavers did, and there was always the risk that drivers would collaborate with other enslaved people, which we see them doing time and time again. Um, to coerce drivers into doing their job, enslavers subjected them to constant surveillance and brutal discipline, effectively terrorizing them into terrorizing others. But even then, drivers pushed back with everything from quiet acts of insubordination, most of which probably never made it into the archival record, to the sort of open defiance we see where drivers led rebellions. But in the end, the driving system effect essentially worked. It helped enslavers get what they wanted more often than not. And I think one of the most insidious reasons why that was the case is that it worked to reify hierarchies and divisions among the enslaved, deliberately pushing drivers and the people they supervise to see one another less as allies than as adversaries, effectively making it that much harder to unite against their common enemy. Before we open up to discussion, which I should say I'm looking forward to more than anything else, I'd like to just conclude with one final thought about the relevance of the driver's story in this moment. It's tempting to see the driving system as an anachronism, as kind of the most perverse feature of a world where production relied on brute force and terror and violence, or as something that disappeared when slavery was abolished or when whips were replaced by wages. But as I see it, the driving system was a fundamentally modern form of labor exploitation and social control, one that was developed or pioneered on Caribbean plantations decades before the Industrial Revolution really got going. I say that because its key features, the insatiable demand for more and more labor and more profit, the total disregard and callousness for workers' safety and health, the sort of relentless surveillance and obsessive accounting we see, all of those are still with us. So, understanding the driver's world is an opportunity or a way to distill racial capitalism to its awful essence, or as the Guyanese historian Walter Rodney might have put it, to see it capitalism without its loincloth. So I'll stop there and thank you in advance for your questions and comments, and again for your attention and joining us here.
Thank you so much, Randy. Oh, let's see who wants to start with the questions. Then you can come on video or you can put in the chat. We prefer on video.
Yeah.
But
And we have a small group today, so I think we can have a good, intimate conversation.
Here we go. So then whoever wants to start,
I can get us started.
go ahead.
And I'm focusing on the middle of the book on the when you start developing the concept of the big man. And one of the things that I wanted you to elaborate on, if you feel comfortable, is the different types of big men arrangements that were in Africa, in West Africa and Central Africa, etc. Because in the book we have a sort of general African sense of the big man, and we go into a lot of nuances of how that manifests in the Caribbean and in the Americas, right? But not enough of a sense of what are the nuances, temporal and spatial, of big man society. Obviously, nobody in this esteemed company would say that all of these societies in Africa were the same, right? So I was wondering if you had seen some of that, if you made that leap, sort of like the way that Vince Browne kind of like went back to look at the different military strategies back in Africa when he was going to claim that these things were operating in Jamaica, kind of like that. All right.
Yeah. No, I appreciate the question, and you're right. Like the Africanist literature, and I should, if it's not obvious, I'm not an Africanist. I've learned a lot from the scholarship of Africanists, and I've read not as much as I should, but I learned a lot from it. You hit the nail on the head. When I'm not seeing, like, what I haven't found is a kind of direct recreation or maintenance of a really specific African social political structure in the Caribbean. Like, that happens with some cultural practices, right? So this is not a like recreating Africa where we can trace, say, like Nkisi from one place to another. The way I think about kind of big man politics is a little bit like Obia, where you're pulling on all these different origins. I think what happens in the case of, and I'll say British Caribbean, which is really my area of specialty, the ethnic diversity of the slave population, where you don't have, now, like, Jamaica is different. You've got this flood of Coromontes or Gold Coast people in the 18th century. In Guyana, it's a bit different. You don't have one kind of overly dominant regional origin of people coming in. And so I think that incentivized drivers to, who may have been, we do have plenty of African-born drivers who presumably remembered and might have tried to recreate these specific political structures from their homelands. Instead, what happens is you have an Igbo driver who's dealing with a population that has Creoles and has Coromontes and has lots of other people here. And so I think what they're trying to do is work on the kind of broadest cultural grammar. If we go back to like Minson Price and think about the kind of creolization of big man politics, that's what I've seen is they're trying to use, big man politics doesn't survive, and African politics don't survive in a way that I found in a really specific way. Instead, they are operating this kind of level of kind of cultural common denominator, or at least there's an incentive for drivers to do that. And we could talk some more and back and forth. I mean, I appreciate the question, but what I didn't find is like, people who are, say, coming from Igbo land, trying to recreate exact, specifically Igbo cultural practices. That may have happened. It doesn't show up in the sort of evidence that I've worked with.
The one explicit, if I just really quick follow up, the one
Yeah.
explicit sort of filter that you create for sort of this process that you're describing right now that may hide any kind of direct connection to a local practice is the filter of gendered Atlanticization, with which brought from a scholar. I'm blanking now. I didn't mark the page.
Yeah.
So in that sense, that the way that it manifests in the Americas, it's already has gone through a sort of gendering that cannot eliminate the European imperial side of it.
Yeah, and that's the
Yeah.
thing. Like, yeah, you're absolutely right. And so, enslavers are incentivizing big men, right? Like, people are not doing this in a vacuum. And there are so many ways that, would-be big men, drivers and other would-be big men are not able to recreate this, right? Like, they can't, a lot of the ways you would accrue followers, they cannot enslave other people, right? One of the primary way you would get followers. They cannot wage wars against rivals. Followers can't pick up and move in search of other attachments. So the dynamics are different in a lot of ways, where people are stuck with one another on these forced labor camps or plantations. So there are some huge differences between dynamics in Africa and the Americas. And so I tried to be careful and say, like, can we use these ideas knowing that most of the people on Caribbean plantations are African or a generation or two removed from African homelands? They're coming from different places. There's going to be some broadly shared cultural ideas about leadership, about the relationships between leaders and followers, to understand how they saw their social relationships. But of course, they're doing this with severe limitations, and there's this inherent tension, right? You like to be being a driver, as a planner would see it, what you're expected to do, and being a big man, those are in absolute contradiction with one another. And so you see the most successful drivers trying to kind of walk that tightrope, as it were, and it's an imperfect balance, of course. It's a great question, though. I appreciate it. That was probably the hardest chapter to write, and the one I got the most kind of pushback and feedback on, and using it. So we'll kind of see what people make of it. But I appreciate the question a lot.
Thank you, Randy. And let's see if you can raise your hand if you have a question or if you want to add to the chat. Otherwise, I would like to let's see. Natasha? Yes, then let's go. I am going to add you to the
Okay.
Go
Hi,
ahead,
everyone.
please.
I'm gonna apologize for my bandwidth. I'm currently in Barbados and it's not the best. So,
Well, I'll be
um,
envious of you, though. I would much prefer to be there than Cincinnati right now. Enjoy.
it's true. I agree with you on that one. So you mentioned that I actually have a couple of questions. So you mentioned that the male drivers, and I'm starting to think that were there any women drivers? And if so, how did it differ from the males? Because you talked about the males, having many families. So how would the women differ in that sense if they were women drivers? That's my first question.
Sorry, I was writing down the question. I'm so glad you asked about this, right? Because yeah, I didn't talk about women drivers explicitly. There are two main things going on. So yes, um, at first glance, it would seem from the evidence that survives that driver was an explicitly male occupation. When you read planners' manuals and when they talk about kind of the driver, their ideal, they're talking about a head driver, and they're coding that as gendered. I mean, they have all their list of qualifications for what they think makes someone a driver or qualified to be appointed as a driver, and they're very clearly thinking about men. And yet, we do know that enslaved women worked as drivers, and they did so in two really different ways. So, on many plantations, enslaved workforces were divided into gangs, and the gang system where you'd have a first gang of the kind of most physically able workers, adult men and women, and the head driver would supervise that gang. You'd have a second gang, a third gang, and sometimes a children's gang, which I'll come back to. What I found was really lots and lots of examples of archival silencing, where I'd find a woman who was clearly working as a driver supervising adults. So in the first or second gang, and then I'd go to try to look her up in other records and triangulate, right? Basic strategy. And for me, that would look at essentially census records, which are slave registration returns. So abstracts of people on plantations where they're, among other things, their name, their age, birthplace, and then their occupation, right? Their official role are recorded. And what I'd see is often enslaved women were working as drivers. They're identified as drivers in, say, a legal complaint. Everybody talks about them as a driver, but their occupation is field labor,
Mm.
something else. And so to me, that's a pretty glaring example of a kind of ideological bias where planners are recognizing women are capable of doing this work, even supervising and punishing. I mean, think about this, supervising and punishing other adult men, and yet they're kind of not able to recognize that in their writing. So I don't want to, overstate the case. It's still true that the majority of drivers supervising adult field laborers were male, but there were many more women than I would have thought. The other main way that women worked as drivers, and this is primarily for what were considered at the time elderly women in their 40s or over who are no longer able to do the work of working in the first field gang as a field laborer, and they supervised the children's gang or the grass gang, or sometimes known as driveresses. And their job was really to acculturate children um, to, to the type of work that was being done on a plantation, to a certain crop, but also more broadly, it's a kind of, I mean, it's a really perverse, planners talk about this as like a nursery school for children. So it's really to teach enslaved children what it means to be an enslaved laborer. So they talk about the role of violence. And so women are kind of socializing children in that third gang into doing, comparatively light work, taking grass for livestock, things like this, but really teaching them kind of what it means to work in unison, that not following orders is going to, lead to violence and things like that. So women do play a key role in drivers. The kind of social stuff, the kind of big man politics and what that looks like for enslaved women, um, I frankly have no idea because the records don't allow me to get into this. And so it's very hard to try to trace enslaved women's roles beyond their kind of official enslaved women drivers roles beyond their official tasks. They just don't show up in any of the types of records I want, with a few exceptions here. So yeah, sorry, it's a long answer to your really good question, but I'm glad you asked that. You had said you had a couple questions. I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you know I hope you can hear me. My internet's acting up.
Yeah. No, you're good.
But Bussa
Yeah.
here in
Yeah.
Barbados, all right, of
Hmm.
the 1860 rebellion.
Yep.
Do you know anything? Do you know? Can you add? And I don't. Do you know about the Bussa rebellion and how he played a role?
Yeah.
That's the second question. And my
Yep.
third and final question is,
Mhm.
um, how did they die? So those who were, well, actually, overall, how would they, if a driver had died and if they were a big man, were there special ways that they were buried, remembered? That's one. And if they were caught in a rebellion, did they have particular punishments for them because of their role? And that's it.
Yeah, I do know Bussa. Yeah, and that's one of the most, well-known examples of a driver or ranger, as he's identified as kind of parallel term for driver used really only in Barbados. And so, yeah, I know that. I know that the really heated debate between Jerry Handler and Hilary Beckles about this. Um, One of the interesting parallels in 1816 or Bussa's rebellion is that you see a similar kind of political divide between Bussa and the other big men who are leading this and ordinary people in Barbados. So yeah, that's one of the more well-known examples of a driver who helps to lead or organize a rebellion. Um, the kind of last two questions, drivers in rebellion, are they getting, you were asking if they're getting like special punishments. Uh, they are in the way that planners pretend to be, enslavers and colonial authorities pretend to be surprised that drivers lead rebellions. And so there's this trope where every time drivers are involved in a rebellion, or accused of participating, they go through this whole kind of it's this ritual of saying, "Oh my God, we can't believe, why would these guys ever lead it? They've been the most trusted. We've trusted them. We've treated them so well. They had no reason to rebel." And so they pretend to be surprised and act like drivers had no reason to want to rebel. And they do hold drivers to a higher standard, and you see that in the punishments. I mean, they're torturing and executing them in about the same ways in terms of the punishments themselves, but the language they're using, they essentially say like drivers were trusted and were rewarded and were given this nice comfortable life. I mean, it's total bullshit, right? Excuse my language, but from their point of view, they're saying these guys had no reason to rebel, and yet they did. And again, I say pretending because they know they're reading one another's correspondence. They know the history of other rebellions. They know that drivers are leading them from really the very origin of the system. Drivers in death and funeral and what they do, I saw nothing about that. I wish I knew. I would love to like be able to do a kind of Reaper's Guard and Vincent Brown like analysis on drivers and see how, burial ceremonies. I have no evidence for that. I'd love to know more about how they're honored, how they're buried, how they're remembered. And that's a kind of black box that maybe someone will find some evidence and be able to pull that thread. It's a great question.
Sorry, one last one. Kufi, the Kufi Rebellion in 1675 or 1695. Was there any evidence that he could have been a driver as well in Barbados? You know?
Not that I know of, but I've not looked at that for a very long time. So, yeah, it's been a long time since I've looked at that actually. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for all these
Thanks so
questions.
much.
No, thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? I would have then a few, but I will try to not repeat what was Natasha already asked about women drivers. But I would like to know more about, if you could develop a little bit more about the relationships between these drivers and enslaved women, especially in what then you mentioned formation of families, but what about the issue, for example, of sexual violence, which we know then usually involves overseers, then slave owners, and what about drivers in this dynamics? Also, if you have any kinds of if you could develop more than beyond things that you already said regarding the origins of this, then are these drivers in terms of statistically, in terms of the demographics in general, are they African born? How many of these drivers are individuals who were born in Africa or not, and how they were selected to occupy these positions? Then this would be things I am curious about then, and you have in the book, but it would be interesting to have here as well for us in the presentation and to bring more discussion.
Yeah, Anna, thanks for both of those questions. So the relationship between drivers and enslaved women was complicated and depended a lot on the individual driver. And I found a full spectrum of relationships, as you might imagine, where on the one hand, drivers were especially attractive people to enslaved women. I don't mean physically, but there were good reasons why, setting aside a kind of love match idea of a marriage or relationship, you might want to be connected to a driver. These were people who as I mentioned earlier, they lived in less materially, less severe conditions of material deprivation than other enslaved people. So in a world where people are really struggling to get, enough to eat and are living really on the knife's edge of survival, drivers really stood out. And so other people wanted to be with them for that reason. I am cautious in kind of thinking of drivers as just like a kind of having a pulling force or attractive force for other people, because there's also quite a lot of evidence that drivers are using their position and the relative impunity they get from white plantation authorities to coerce enslaved women into sexual relationships and into marriage. And that ran the gamut from kind of outright sexual violence and assault, again, pretty much impunity from planners, to drivers really pursuing and pressuring enslaved women to enter into a marriage they didn't want to be in, to keep enslaved women who want to leave. I found plenty of cases of enslaved women who essentially leave or end a marriage as they see it, and the driver still asserts claims of sexual ownership over them, and is supported by the overseer, the manager, by legal officials as well. There are cases where drivers make really explicit threats. There's one in Jamaica I talk about in the book where the driver is threatening to kill an enslaved woman and her children if she won't submit or agree to marry him. And so I think there are multiple reasons why you see enslaved women with drivers. I was also struck by some evidence where enslaved women who are married to drivers seem to be real authority figures in their own right. Now, there's a kind of chicken and the egg. How much of that is something they have before they ever marry a driver, and a driver is interested in marrying someone or a relationship with a powerful figure, in her own right, and how much does a woman's connection to a driver enhance her social status even further? I don't have a method for kind of figuring that out. What I do see is when drivers are demoted, not only do drivers themselves sometimes protest, but their wives can sometimes lead these huge campaigns, essentially, of resistance, organizing strikes and slowdowns, resisting and pushing back. So that was a way for me understanding that the position of the driver and the status that came with it, maybe the material benefits as well, clearly mattered to at least some enslaved women who are with drivers. That part of what they valued in that particular man was the driving or the position of driver itself. The origins and the kind of selection that went on and the kind of demographics you asked about, a couple different things. I think I started this book assuming, kind of taking for granted what I'd read from other historians, that, drivers tended to be Creoles, wanted Creoles, that is, men born in the Americas rather than Africans. It's not really true. I mean, the kind of handful of times I tried to do the demographic work in different colonies, it seems to be a relatively even mix. Now, of course, the demographics and the African versus Creole population, those change over time. After the slave trade, it's very different. But in general, planners are much less interested in the birthplace than they are. I mean, their kind of main criteria for a driver, a few different things. One, it's someone who is skilled at the particular work. We've got to remember this is a skilled managerial position. It's not simply like, let's get the most intimidating person that can kind of boss people around. They want someone who's skilled in the work. They also are really, to me at least, surprisingly candid about how they want someone who has influence within the slave community, someone who is respected as a leader, someone that other people are going to listen to. So there's a way that, back to kind of a big man, becoming a driver further enhanced your ability to act like a big man. But I think a lot of drivers were already big men within the slave communities themselves. So planners wanted someone they could trust, but someone that was also trusted by other enslaved people. And again, the driver, right? Those are two different things. They also want someone, part of that comes along the idea of trust is they want someone who they've known for a while. It's not like you would say you're a recent survivor of the Middle Passage. You don't become a driver within the first couple years you've been there. They're picking people I found that they've probably known for quite a long time. Usually drivers are not appointed into their late 20s or 30s, which is fairly old for enslaved men. And the reason why, again, is someone who has worked for quite a while and established a reputation, both within the slave community and for planners. And then therefore then you see Africans who've been there for quite a while versus your recent arrivals, and you see Creoles more or less evenly split. Again, colony by colony or over time is going to change that a bit. I hope that answers the kind of select.
Yes, it does, and it's really that you cover a lot. Thank you so much. Then we have one, Jennifer. I don't know if Jennifer wants to go. Yes, she wants to come. Like,
oh, you're on mute.
Yes, I just realized that. Thank you very much. I enjoyed reading your book. And And I really appreciate the way that you take on this very difficult subject. And I think at one point you refer to the drivers as really walking on a knife's edge, right? Between kind of being a leader of the community, but then also responsible for enforcing the violence of enslavement. And I really understand your reasons for not wanting to do the chronological and sort of temporal organization of the book. But I would like to hear you talk about whether you did find any kind of significant differences. You just mentioned actually kind of the changing demographics over time in terms of the balance of Creole and Africans. But if there were any other kind of significant temporal or chronological or
Yeah. Thanks for the kind words about the book and for the question. And yeah, there is a lot. I don't want to. Well, let me just be clear. The position. It's not like the position of the driver in the driving system is static. So, in a lot of ways, a 1680s sugar plantation in Barbados and a late 19th century plantation in Cuba are worlds apart in a lot of ways in terms of the scale. And so, a few things. I just kind of say under that heading. One, the position of the driver evolves, and we have several decades of slavery and sugar production in the Americas before you get, to my knowledge, of the driver. The first explicit reference comes from, going off the top of my head, I think it's 1679. It's a letter to instructions, an instructed series of instructions to overseers in Barbados from a planter named Henry Drax. And so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out the origin of the driver. One question that drove me nuts in this book was like, when do we first get drivers? And I thought I was going to find it in northeastern Brazil. Thought like, let's go to ground zero. And then, or I thought maybe I'd find it in Sao Tome or in Príncipe, and I don't. You find these kind of forerunners of it. You find a Meses de Azúcar, like a sugar master or a foreman. So there's a precedent, several precedents for using enslaved men or sometimes free African men working on plantation in these positions of authority, supervisory positions. But the first clear drivers I saw really seemed to come from Barbados in the mid to late 17th century. And I think that's because you get the rise of the gang system of labor. So plantations become larger. They're so-called integrated plantations where you're not cutting sugarcane in one place and then milling it on another, right? You're integrating the manufacturing and the growing processes together. And so you get a larger labor force and you get need for greater supervision and kind of organization of labor. So I think that's one thing that happens. I think over time, as plantations get even larger, you get these multiple gangs, and so the scale becomes larger. That's to say nothing of, fast forwarding 2 centuries roughly and getting into kind of second slavery and even more industrial slavery. So I suspect that there are some ways the position changes over time. In terms of the kind of sociological dynamics and power dynamics, though, that's what I was finding that was more similar, that the driver's essential predicament of having, not just unreasonable, but insane labor demands above them, and people who have, again, no matter where, they have no incentive to work. They don't want to be there. They want to resist. They want to be free. They don't want to do any work. The driver's got to try to solve that problem, basically. Like that's his day in, day out. And I think that is similar on whatever crop regime. Now, again, a sugar plantation has many important differences from a cotton plantation or a coffee plantation. And some crops don't really lend themselves to gang labor or to drivers. And so there are some important differences. I just chose to focus on other things in this book. I appreciate that question. I hope it, and that's one thing, reviews of the book are starting to come out now. And that's one thing people are focusing on a bit in reviews. I mean, even if you like a book, you've got to find something to say. And that's one thing people focused on is most of the book takes place late 18th, early 19th century British Caribbean. And to that, I think that's absolutely fair and true. And someone else can pick up that thread. And if they want to do a kind of change in the driving system over time or driver, I'd love to see it and learn more. Thank you for your questions and comments.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I wanna
Alex?
I wanna follow up on a combination of a follow-up on Jennifer's question and Anna's question. So and you already kind of provided answers, of course. This is coming out in review and people will continue pulling at that thread, I'm sure. I mean, this is probably the beginning of a line of work that graduate students will pursue, etc. But I wanted to think about with you about social relations that escape the sort of binary trope that you create. I know that's the center of the book, is the trope of the being caught in an impossible situation in the middle, right? Both oppressed and oppressor. And the book is drafted around that sort of trope. It's an organizing principle, right? Which you yourself acknowledged. But what about other relationships, like to the house folk or to folks in the kin network outside of the field gang, right? So it's you put them between the managers and the field workers. But we know that the kin networks and other types of networks are present and operative there. And the way in which this follows Jennifer's question is because after emancipation, then we imagine that they go on to land in perhaps better spots in the aftermath in the social hierarchies of Barbados, of Guyana, and that you may have seen this in your research. So even though you don't talk about it in the book, I'm curious to see what did you see in the research in terms of these extended networks that didn't make it to the book because they're not part of the trope, and also the aftermath of their place. How did they land in the society after emancipation?
Yeah, I'll answer that. Fascinating questions and provocative questions, Alex. I'll answer the second one about kind of the aftermath and post-emancipation, in part because I have very little to say there. The nature of the records that exist and that I have make it extremely difficult to follow people from the period of slavery to the period of emancipation, follow individual people. And so I would love to know what individual drivers end up doing. And in the vast majority of cases, the evidence just doesn't exist to look at that. Now, some things we do know, the driving system survives. I mean, the plantation system and the driving system survive. Into the 20th century, there's actually a drivers association in Guyana that gets renamed to something like Barry Higman just mentioned that in a review of my book. And so embarrassingly, I can't come up with the name, but it's renamed something else because it seems to be, they get squeamish about the term driver. So the position of the driver exists after slavery on plantations, even supervising free laborers, right? Well, nominally free, indentured laborers and others. So that's one thing. And presumably, I mean, I would guess a lot of the people who are doing that work are the people who were skilled at doing that, or, people were doing that under slavery. If you're still working on plantations. So that's one continuity. But I just haven't seen that. You see them during the period of apprenticeship in Jamaica specifically. There's a well-known narrative of James Williams that Diana Payton has done an edited collection on, and talks about drivers in the workhouses, so essentially the state-run prisons. And so there's shifting and essentially using their skills and their position to supervise coerced laborers and punish people for the state rather than for private planners there. But I don't have a ton to say on that. And that's, one thing I'd love to see someone be able to follow up on. The first question about these kind of social relationships that don't fit into this kind of driver caught between, I think that's true as an organizing principle for the book. I think it becomes less true over time. And so I think we start, we just think of the structure of the book, and what I wanted to do is move from the most obvious or predictable creation of the driving system and then the driver's role, looking at the pressures on them from above, and then their reaction to that and trying to make it work from below, and then shifting into big men was a way to try to move into drivers' social relationships, which of course are colored and shaped by the context in which they're living. But there are these moments where you see not everything is a driver kind of calculating up and down, or looking on both sides. And then especially when we get to which is the last chapter in the book on rebellion, one of the things that I didn't emphasize in that rebellion, but someone else could, is the relationships between drivers in African nations and other leaders of these African nations. And more broadly, the kind of two different, there's a geographic orientation here of a plantation, which is a discrete entity, and maybe there's neighborhoods, to borrow another term, right? But that's really thinking of it from the planner's point of view, where a driver has authority over the people on the plantation because the planner says they do. And maybe the driver's created a certain amount of earned authority there as well. When drivers get into these African nations, though, which span across wider geographies and are not political communities that are controlled and certainly not created by enslavers or colonial authorities, that can cut both ways for drivers. In some ways, the presence of African nations or national groups can enhance a driver's authority, right? If you can be both a driver and then you're the king of the Congos, that immediately gives you a range of followers that are not only on your plantation, they're across the entire colony or entire island, or at least a portion of it. At the same time, that puts you as a driver, though, into conflict with other leaders of these national groups. Like, what happens when you're, say, a head driver and you're a Congo but there's another man who happens to be a carpenter, a field laborer, and he is the king of the Congos, right? Like that is a tension there that exists. And so I see some moments like that where there are people vying for the kingship or for different officer positions or working with one another, and they host meals and they toast one another. They also get into fights with one another and arguments there. So like that is something that, we always want more space to write, and no one says like, oh, I wish this chapter was way longer, right? But that, if I were following a different thread in that chapter, is exactly the type of thing I'd be working on, which I think gets in some ways to like these other social relationships, which is a different orientation than the driver thinking about people below him and people above him. That's him thinking about kind of other leaders who have a whole different source of social and political authority, which is not coming from official appointment. Does that make sense, or is it along the range of your, that's not kinship network, and those are really hard to trace, but that's a social community in a different way. I don't know, that's what I thought of at least when you were talking.
Yeah, I thought it was very satisfying. Thank you. Anna,
I would have another question, and probably this will be the last, unless there is someone else who wants to ask. So my question would be about the records that you used, and I want to say the correct name, records of the fiscal and protectors of the slaves. Then if you want to tell us a little bit more about this archive and the issue of testimonies that you can find. And if you think that based on what you did with these records, if there are other dimensions that you could point out to us in terms of elements that you didn't explore and that you think that these records would offer for further studies. And finally, what you'll be doing next, if you want to share with us.
Yeah, sure. I'm glad you asked about the records. I was determined with this book, as I said at the outset, to get as close as I could to day-to-day experience of drivers. I didn't want this to be a book about plantation management or the system, and certainly not one kind of replicating a planner's understanding of drivers. And so I should say I cast a really wide net. I looked at everything I could possibly find about drivers, in English and in Spanish and Portuguese, my other languages. My French relied on me using a lot of translated work. And so I looked really widely geographically, linguistically, and drivers show up in all kinds of records. Planners, other historians are all kind of recognizing drivers really important. They're used more or less everywhere. And so that was really helpful. And yet a lot of the time, as with the study of enslaved people in general, they're not showing up in their own words. We're getting other people talking about them. We're getting the people, their enemies writing about them. That's why I ended up concentrating on this body of legal records. It's a remarkable body of work. There's more than 10,000 pages. Again, they only exist for a subset of British colonies in the early 19th century. And so they geographically and chronologically constrain the study. And yet I chose to really focus on them and then triangulate with other literature because they get us as close as possible to enslaved people's own testimony and experiences. These are people who go and appeal for redress to the colonial government. Now, there are all kinds of limitations with these records, right? I mean, they're legal records with their own silences and gaps. One of the most, things that doesn't show up in these is enslaved women as drivers show up very, very rarely. And so there's this huge gap where we know from other records that women are doing this, but I know very little about like the actual experiences of women themselves, say supervising children, and what they thought about that, how they felt about that. And so there are advantages and disadvantages to that body of work. I guess say more and more and more about them. I guess the one last thing to say about them, I think because they're legal records, they're records of disputes where enslaved people are going and complaining about something that happened to them that involved a driver. They probably exaggerate the degree of conflict and violence between drivers and other enslaved people. And maybe this ties a little bit back to Alex's point a minute ago. People don't go to court when things are going well, and they don't go to court and talk generally about things that might be illegal. So they're not, sometimes this filters through, but they're not generally talking about drivers helping them, escape the field when they need to nurse an infant. That comes up here or there, but presumably that happens much more often than it shows up in the records. They're not talking about drivers, organizing campaigns of resistance. And so there's a whole probably range of things that are going on that don't make it into these records because they concentrate on enslaved people trying to get some redress for something that's illegal under this very narrow definition of kind of mistreatment during the era of amelioration. In terms of next, probably too many things at the same time, but one project I'm working on has to do with enslaved people's memories of rebellions. I was struck in this rebellion chapter that people remember very explicitly previous rebellions, and not in some sort of kind of abstract way, but remember individual names and punishments and what happened, and that those memories, in addition to their own aspirations, are shaping their calculus, their decisions about why they want to join the rebellion, why they don't, what they do. And so I was able to trace over a roughly 60-year period enslaved people's collective memory, or memories plural, of rebellions. So I've been pulling that thread really since writing this book, a lot more than I could fit into that chapter, and enjoying working on that so far.
Oh, this is great. I'm curious to see this work. And we still have a last question from Natasha. Then she's in the chat and she's asking if there is any evidence of clashes between drivers, especially with the reference to the King of the Congo and the King of the Mandingos.
Oh, plenty of, yes, competition, conflict between drivers, absolutely. Maybe just to give you one tangible example having to do with drivers in rebellion, one of the whistleblowers in the 1813-14 Berbice plot, he's a driver, he's the second driver on a large cotton plantation, and his child was flogged or beaten, it's a bit unclear from the record, by the other driver. And he cites this as one of his reasons for betraying the rebellion. So it seems in that case, among the other reasons this driver may not want to get involved in the rebellion, is he's essentially trying to get back at this driver who he held accountable for harming his child. So tons of examples like that, but I'm sensitive to our time. I appreciate the question. But yeah, there's lots of conflict and division between drivers themselves as well.
So we are getting to the end. Then, first of all, thank you so much, Randy, for this great book. And I think that it's clear here that we had a very rich discussion, and we could still go further. So everyone, then do not forget that this is the book, The Driver's Story, and let me just put it here this way. And it was published in 2024 with Penn Press, then University of Pennsylvania Press. So you can hope you take a look at the book. It's a book that is really also pleasant to read. Then and I think that it can fit very well like courses then on the history of the Caribbean, the African diaspora, history of slavery, the Atlantic slave trade. Then I would really recommend. And thank you so much, Randy. We are going to be back here on April 19, I believe, which is our next session with the book Plantation Boots with Seth Rockman, which is our then another historian who is part of this group who published books on slavery in 2024. So thank you so much, Randy, again, and hope this book continues making a very long path and with awards and everything it deserves. Thank you.
Thanks so much to all of you. This was a real
Thank
treat.
you, Randy.
So appreciate your time this afternoon and your questions and comments. Thanks to you all.
Thank you, and thank you, Alex.
And thank everybody.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Anna.
Bye-bye.